Welcome to Eat, Sleep, Wine, Repeat, a podcast for all you wine lovers who, if you're like me, just cannot get enough of the good stuff. I'm Janina, your host, brand ambassador, wine educator, and sommelier. So stick with me as we dive deeper into this ever-evolving, wonderful world of wine. And wherever you are listening to this, cheers to you. Hello, wine friends, and welcome back. Last Thursday, November the 20th, was Beaujolais Nouveau Day. So did you celebrate? Well, that day is very much for fun, but today we're taking a slightly more serious turn as I chat with Master of Wine Natasha Hughes, author of The Wines of Beaujolais, about her journey into wine, why she chose to focus on this fascinating region, and what most people are getting wrong about Beaujolais. We're going to explore everything from the region's 300 plus soil types and ancient vines to innovative winemaking techniques, standout producers, and wherein Beaujolais offers you the best value. If you are enjoying the episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or a star rating on Spotify. It really helps the algorithm share the show with more wine lovers like yourself. But before we start, how about a wine fact of the day? Did you know that paradise can be found in Beaujolais? It's the name given to the first pressed juice from whole grapes, intensely fruity, low in tannins, and celebrated every October at the Fête du Paradis, so the Paradise Fête, which is held in Audenat, where wine growers show their know-how with wine lovers in the autumn sunshine. And do wait to the very end of this episode. I have the best anecdote you will want to hear. So pour yourself a glass, ideally Gamay or Beaujolais Blanc, so that is your Chardonnay. Get comfortable and enjoy the episode. Thank you so much, Natasha, for sharing a little bit of your time to talk about wine, your book, Beaujolais. So thank you for joining me.
No, it's a pleasure to be here.
And I guess the main focus of this episode is, of course, going to be Beaujolais because you have written this incredible book, but also...
Oh, snap.
Oh, look,
there we go.
Yeah, everyone listening, you can't see, but we're shaking the same book at each other. We've connected through word. But talking of words, it does say MW after your name. And as we were talking off air, my gosh, Master of Wine is a massive undertaking. So just to ease people into our conversation, can you just talk a little bit about, I guess, your journey into wine and then what led you to pursue the Master of Wine qualification?
So to be honest, it was never part of the game plan.
Interesting.
Like many of my colleagues, I stumbled into writing about wine. Actually, my first interest, I guess, was food, and I ran a catering company part-time when I was at university. So always very interested in flavour. Wine was kind of part of the background. You know, my dad enjoyed wine, but it was never something that I really learnt about or considered a career in. After I finished university, I went to live in Australia and came back as a book editor.
As you do.
As you do. And ended up actually subbing copy, editing copy in magazines as a freelancer. And I got offered 2 or 3 weeks' work at Decanter.
Okay.
And I liked them and they liked me and they kept giving me work. And it was at the start of, they just launched a website and they needed people to write copy for the website.
Yeah.
And eventually they gave me a job as deputy editor on the website. Mm-hmm. So that's how I began my career as a wine writer.
Incredible. And then you were like, right, I'm going to study this to the nth degree.
Well, to be quite honest, what happened was that after about my first year at Decanter, the publishing company that owned the website suddenly realized that they didn't know how to make money out of a website. So I lost my job.
Oh.
And decided that actually, if I wanted to, I quite enjoyed this world of wine and food. And if I wanted to keep on writing about it, I might as well sort of freelance. And I began freelancing, and it took a while to get going. But within about a year or two, I was writing regularly for many of the magazines and websites in the UK, and sometimes some overseas ones. And I did that for a few years. Then the economic crisis happened in 2008, and magazines began losing money and employing fewer freelancers. And I realized that I needed to stand out from the crowd. In the meantime, I had a friend, a colleague who was a master of wine, who kept saying, "You really should do it, And I was like, yeah, no, it's almost impossible. Why on earth would I want to do that? But, I've always enjoyed that feeling that if something is almost impossible, I really should have a crack at it. So even though I was going, no, I'm not going to do this, part of me was going, maybe I should have a go.
Love that. What a great personality trait. Wonderful.
Yeah. So I decided I was going to have a go, and I did.
And you didn't just have a go, because if I've understood correctly, when you graduated, you won 4 out of the 7 prizes available, including, if I'm not wrong, the Outstanding Achievement Award.
This is correct. I mean, I was helped in that by the fact that I had an unusually small graduating class. So statistics if you have a small graduating class, quite often somebody carries away all the prizes, whereas if there's 20 of you, the love gets spread a little bit more evenly.
Never let the truth get in the way of a good story.
But there were only 6 of us. So, yeah, I picked up a few awards, and it was great because, my mum, who never really understood what I was doing and why I was doing it. And she needed to ask my husband whether I was a good writer rather than trusting the fact that I'd made a career out of it. Anyway, she was there in the front row in the audience, and a friend of mine who was on stage handing out some of the awards that evening, she said, "By the time you went out for that 4th award, I thought your mother was going to explode."
Oh, that's beautiful.
I just love the fact that she was there and she saw that happen, and it kind of gave her, the confidence to believe in me a little bit more.
Well, that actually is really, really beautiful. And obviously, with all of the things that have happened to you, it has also encouraged you and given you extra confidence, probably, to write a book. And The Wines of Beaujolais is your first solo book, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. I've contributed chapters to books that are effectively compilations, sort of on California, on Champagne. I've written chapters for those books. And many, many years ago, I co-authored a 500 white wines you need to try before you die kind of book.
Oh.
A sort of listicle thing.
Mm-hmm.
But this was, yes, my first solo book.
So why Beaujolais?
The truth is that I've long had a love for Beaujolais. I started visiting Beaujolais over 20 years ago when it was a region that was really on its uppers. The crash that came, the hangover that came from the party that was Beaujolais Nouveau, which drove the economy of that region for a good couple of decades. The crash had come and people were suffering from the hangover. The region was really not doing terribly well. And I started visiting it. And even I could see, there was huge potential there, but I could see that people were struggling. But it's an extraordinarily beautiful region. It's got great potential. And I noticed in recent years that Beaujolais was beginning to sort of emerge from this era of a loss of identity and a loss of confidence. And it was coming into its own again. And I thought it's a great time to write a book about the region. And luckily, the publishers agreed with me.
Beaujolais Nouveau has, of course, been a really big thing, marketing in the past. The idea, I think most people think Beaujolais is a very simple, light, easy drinking wine. What do you think people are really getting wrong about Beaujolais?
I think there's a failure to understand. And I think, Beaujolais has been complicit in this because they haven't really worked out how to communicate this effectively. But I think this one message that, Beaujolais equals Beaujolais Nouveau worked at a time when, if you think back to the heyday of Beaujolais Nouveau, it began in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, New World wines hadn't really hit the supermarkets. So if you were looking for a light, affordable, fruity style of wine, Beaujolais was pretty much not the only game in town, but it really filled that niche very, very well. And then, along came Australian wine, selling sunshine in a glass, and Chilean wine, and Argentina with its Malbec. And Beaujolais kind of lost ground to those countries and those regions. And it hadn't made a case for the fact that it's actually a region that's very, very capable of producing very high quality, a very diverse range of styles. And that's how we got to the fact that it lost its mojo.
Yeah. Well, I think you just hit on diversity. I was really surprised. I was at a Beaujolais tasting recently, and they were really showcasing soils. And I think they were talking about the main 11 soils or 12 soils. But you actually talk in the book about the 300 soil types in this very small area. So, I mean, what is the impact of this soil diversity?
So first of all, just to set up some context, Beaujolais is a pretty small region. It's about 70 kilometers from north to south.
Right, yeah.
And at its widest point, it's about 20 kilometers across. So, depending on which road you take, you can drive from north to south Beaujolais in, an hour or so, easily. It's pretty small. And in 2009, they began digging these soil pits across the region. Every 20 hectares, they dug a soil pit. And then every sort of 1.5 hectares, they dug slightly shallower soil pits just to check that, everything was on the right track. And what they found was this amazing diversity of soil types. There are over 300. I mean, these are nuances. These are nuances for the geologists. But actually, in broad brush strokes, there's about 20 different soil types that are commonly found across the region. And if you ally this diversity of soil types to the fact that where you are in Beaujolais is between two mountain ranges, you're between the Massif Central to the west, and to the east you've got the Alps.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got this kind of folded region of hills with quite a lot of variation in altitude and exposure. And if you ally these soil types to these altitudes, this range of altitudes and range of exposures, you've got this kind of inbuilt complexity of terroir into the region to start with, before you've even planted a single vine.
I think when I was going through the book as well, you talk about that obviously we have the pyramid and Beaujolais and then Beaujolais Villages and then the Crus. But actually, again, there is so much more nuance. It's not just that standard pyramid. I mean, how would you, without going into this crazy detail of looking at every single cru and whatever, do you find there are specific areas that are more, that it's easier to understand so that somebody could kind of get an idea of what to expect based on what they might see on the label?
So, well, before we even get into that, there's another layer of complexity.
Here we go.
And that is that there are actually 4 main winemaking techniques used in Burgundy. Whereas pretty much anywhere else in the world you go, they make red wines in a similar way. Grapes are more or less destemmed. They're crushed. You ferment using yeast, so it's an alcoholic fermentation, and you extract tannins, and then you press the juices off. Actually, in Beaujolais, even though you've got that kind of winemaking, which is often referred to in the region as Burgundian winemaking, you've got full carbonic maceration and semi-carbonic maceration, which are both based on intracellular fermentation. So the idea is that the juice doesn't escape, or very little juice escapes from the grapes to create an alcoholic fermentation using yeast. What you've got is the enzymes within the grapes actually create a different kind of fermentation. And then on top of that, you've got something else called thermovinification, which uses very high temperatures to extract flavor and color with very little tannin very quickly. And some producers actually use a combination of winemaking techniques. So you've got this terroir complexity with all the different hills, the different altitudes, the different exposures, the different soil types, and you've got all these winemaking techniques. So it's very difficult to actually look at a map or think of a cru and think, well, this is what to expect.
Well, I want to pick your brain in terms of winemaking here, because thermovinification is not something that I know that much about. But what you've just described is the idea that because of the higher temperatures, you get all of this fruit and less tannin. But when you do carbonic maceration, because of that intracellular fermentation, it's about extracting all of this like fruitiness and less of the tannins. So both of them, in theory, just like that, sound the same, but they're quite clearly not. So what would you get from the two?
They're very different. So what happens with thermovinification is that the grapes pop because of the heat. So you liberate the juices. So you've got to, typically they add cultured yeast. So you impose a fairly simple kind of flavor profile on the wines that you make through thermovinification. Whereas with the enzymatic fermentation that happens in carbonic maceration, it's a slower process typically, which means that you get more layers of flavor, and also those flavors are intrinsic to the grapes themselves. They're not imposed from outside.
Right. Okay. And when you study carbonic maceration, people talk about lots of these juicy fruits, and even they say, bubblegum, this kind of style. Do you think that's fair? Are there top producers using carbonic in a serious way?
So the first answer I would give is that I think that this idea that carbonic maceration gives you this bubblegum character actually is not really true.
Okay.
I think that bubblegum character and that kind of candied, confected fruit that we associate with simple Beaujolais typically comes from wines made using thermovinification. There was a particular kind of yeast that was widely used in the past, less so now, that typically imposes this kind of bubblegummy, jammy, simple character on the wines created using that technique. I really struggled when I was tasting, and I've tasted a lot of Beaujolais in the past couple of years. I really struggled to find that bubblegum character in most of the wines that I tasted.
Okay. So you've touched on these different winemaking techniques. Many winemakers are now doing several and then putting a blend together. We've got the different elevations. We've got different vineyard exposure. We have primarily 20 different soil types without going too far. Gosh, how does one choose a Beaujolais and a style that's going to suit them?
So I think you can make some broad brushstroke generalizations. In the Crus, one of the main soil types is this pink granite, which is this volcanic derived rock that degrades into this kind of almost sort of sand over time, which is incredibly free draining. I mean, you can walk in the vineyards after heavy rains and the mud doesn't stick to your boots. It's the most extraordinary thing.
That's crazy. Interesting.
This pink granite soil, which is really dominant in some of the crus, particularly crus like Fleury and Chiroubles, Moulin-à-Vent, Chenin, Renier, all have a lot of pink granite. And typically the wines that I associate with this pink granite are often very fine-boned, red-fruited, very perfumed. If you know your Beaujolais, if you know your Burgundy, for instance, the analogy that I often draw is that it's very similar to Volnay or Chambol-Musigny with this kind of delicacy and perfume and lightness of touch, very red-fruited. Whereas you also have, and it's sort of slightly more isolated outcrops of a soil type called diorite, which is also volcanic in origin. But this degrades to a sort of fine powdery clay. It's a much richer, denser soil.
Okay.
And what you tend to find with the wines made from grapes grown on diorite is that they're bigger and bolder and darker fruited and more structured and more tannic and often slightly riper, slightly more alcoholic. And you find this diorite soil in the Cru of Juliana. The majority of the Côte de Bruy comes from this diorite soil. And the most famous bit of Morgon, the Côte du Puy, is also diorite. And it's no wonder that typically when people talk about wines from the Côte du Puy or the Côte de Bruy, they talk about wines that are dense and rich and powerful and structured.
Interesting. Okay. I suppose it's one of those things, isn't it? That even within, when you have a Chiroubles or a Morgon or whatever, that actually there is still so much diversity within it.
So I've talked a little bit about the granite that predominates in Chiroubles and Moulin-à-Vent, Fleury, Renier. Actually, the only one of those that is entirely based on pink granite is Chiroubles. All the others have different soil types as well as the pink granite.
Interesting. I've always found, and I don't drink enough Beaujolais, but there has been in my head with Chiroubles, it's more like fresh herbs. There is a lightness and brightness, and maybe this alpine herbal edge that I'm kind of like extracting is because the granite is giving you such finesse and delicacy.
So there's a couple of things to know about Chiroubles. One is that it is 100% pink granite. The other is that it is the highest in altitude of all of the crus. So if you have that high altitude, which lends you freshness, if you're using semi-carbonic maceration, or even if you're using some Burgundian vinification and you're using some whole bunch, even if you crush the berries, you've got some contact between the juice and the stems. What it does is that whole bunch character gives you some of that kind of the spice and that character that I think of it's sort of teetering on a balance between, is it floral or is it herbal? Is it, it gives this kind of slight crunchiness, that slight stemminess to the wines. So that's probably what you're finding in a Chiroubles.
Yes, a wild, outdoorsy crunch. Okay, I love that, because what you've actually done is, in a way, yes, it's harder to define every single specific cru because of the diversity, but Chiroubles, for anybody, there's pink granite, high altitude, floral, herbal, wild, outdoorsy crunch, light, delicate finesse. Is that good?
Absolutely.
Yes, okay.
The trouble is that Chiroubles is the only cru that actually you can say that's what it's like.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, listen, we've got one. That's 1/10 that we've already figured out and we've sorted out.
Absolutely.
But would you say, though, that still harder to completely one brush stroke, but Moulin-à-Vent and Morgon if people want almost the opposite, the bigger, bolder, age-worthy, long-lived styles, would you put those two at the top?
So I think if you like... So another analogy that I find useful is not the reference to the north, to Burgundy, but also to look further south, because the vineyards of the Northern Rhone are equidistant from Beaujolais. So Beaujolais lies pretty much halfway between the Côte d'Or and the Northern Rhone. And like the Northern Rhone, there's a lot of granitic soil. And I think if you think of Chiroubles and Fleury maybe being a bit like Côte Rôtie, you know, the more sort of delicate, linear perfume style, I think Morgon, particularly the Côte du Py, and also the Côte de Bruy, and bits of Juliana, I think the analogy here is Cornas or even Hermitage, where you've got those bigger, riper, more powerful, more structured styles. And actually what's really interesting is that as some of these Beaujolais age, and Beaujolais can age incredibly well, contrary to reputation. So what tends to happen is that quite often the more delicate sort of pink granity styles look a lot like Pinot as they age. And sometimes the denser, richer styles can look a lot like sinewy, spicy, peppery Syrah.
Interesting.
As they age. Moulin-à-Vent does age well, but it tends to age, it is structured, but it's more fine, elegant structure rather than big, burly, powerful structure.
Okay, interesting. I mean, honestly, just listening to you I've never heard anyone describe a comparison of aged Beaujolais to either Pinot Noir and or Syrah. So this is just making it you're making it more concrete of how diverse this region is.
I'll throw something else into the mix.
Oh,
Some of these wines actually also can look a lot like something like Nebbiolo. I mean, maybe not quite as tannic as Nebbiolo, but you can get a surprising amount of structure out of Gamay grown in the right soil type with the right winemaking technique. And because of that floral character,
the roses
and that red fruit, and you can find analogies as well between Nebbiolo and Gamay.
And actually as well, I've often found in the one or two bottles of aged Beaujolais that I have had, so not many, but I've even noticed a truffle note. And so, I mean, of course you can get that truffle note in Pinot Noir, but you can also get that truffle note in Barolo, Nebbiolo.
Yep.
So, okay, interesting just to kind of see where we want to place premium Gamay, which also, for anybody who's listening, Gamay is the grape variety. Just in case anybody is new to Beaujolais, Gamay is the grape variety. Let's talk about these old vines, because we've now touched on diversity. But some of the oldest vines in France, there's 100-year-old vines, are in Beaujolais. Where are they? Where do we find them?
So if you look at the Crus particularly, this is less true in the southern bit of Beaujolais, which is the Appellation Beaujolais zone. But in the Crus and in the villages, there are plenty of old vineyards. The only other region in France that has a similar wealth of old vineyards is Languedoc-Roussillon, and largely for similar reasons, which is that both Beaujolais and Languedoc-Roussillon had a burst of popularity in the early part of the 20th century, and there was a good reason to plant vineyards up on the slopes. And then both regions lost popularity, they lost some of their prestige. And actually, for a lot of growers, either wasn't worth grubbing up the vines, or else, they had a sentimental attachment to the vineyards that their fathers or their grandfathers planted. So they left them there. And Beaujolais has, yes, absolutely the most amazing wealth of 60, 80, there's even some pre-phylloxera vines still planted on their own roots in Beaujolais. Not very many, but they're there.
Wow. And I suppose when you were saying about there's a sandiness as well that obviously phylloxera can't travel through, hence why we have a few of
Yeah,
them.
so it's not sand as in the silica-based sand. It's this granitic sand, but effectively it's got this same kind of structure that means that the phylloxera louse can't really thrive in it.
And have you found by tasting some of these Beaujolais wines made from old vines, do they specifically show something different? Are you noticing anything?
So there's been a lot of interest in the wine world relatively recently in old vines, and there's a growing amount of attention being paid to regions where there are old vines. So particularly places like the Barossa, which has the Old Vine Charter, there's the Old Vine Project in South Africa. There's a real value placed on old vines, and this is because old vines give you something special, that they give you great concentration of fruit.
Yep.
Largely because yields tend to be lower. And one of the reasons why old vineyards often get uprooted is that the yields are low. So there's a high cost of production as well. You know, you don't get as much money out of these vineyards. Also in Beaujolais, you've got a problem in that these are old bush vines with very low to the ground fruiting zones. They're incredibly hard to work and allied to these steep slopes. If you think about how cheap Beaujolais is, you know, for a lot of producers working these old vineyards
It's just not worth it.
It's a labor of love.
Mhm.
If they keep them going, it's a labor of love rather than they're making good money out of it. But those old vines have deep roots, and generally they cope better with everything that the weather can throw at them in any given year. So quite often, as well as great concentration, you often end up with great balance. Theoretically, although nobody is exactly sure how it works, you have a greater terroir influence. It's probably to do with those extended root systems. So, you know, most of us in the wine world believe that you get higher quality of wine out of old vines. And that's why Beaujolais is an absolute unexplored treasure trove, really.
Well, the fact that the winemakers seem to be working a little bit more collaboratively now, I think you mentioned in your book over the past 20 years, the winemaking culture has shifted. Do you think that will help with this message and the old vines? What do you think is happening now?
So I think there was always a spirit of collaboration in the region in terms of practical aid. You know, your neighbor needed a hand picking his grapes because the rain was coming in and you'd already finished your harvest. You go and lend a hand. Your neighbor's tractor had broken down and yours was working fine, so you'd lend him your tractor. You know, that was fine. But what that wasn't was an exchange of ideas. When I first went to Beaujolais, it was a French country region with, you know, people who had rarely left their home region. They knew their wines, they knew the wines of their neighbors, but they didn't know the wines from their, you know, regions elsewhere in France, never mind the wines of the world. They hadn't traveled. And over the intervening years, there's a new generation that's come in. So in part, it's the sons and daughters of the people I met during my first visits, but also outsiders to the region have come into the region, and they've brought with them. So the sons and daughters of the previous generation have gone and studied wine at college, and quite often they've studied alongside the sons and daughters of producers from elsewhere in France. Many of them have traveled and done stage in the wineries elsewhere in France and often in the New World, and they'd come home with new ideas, not necessarily influencing the way they make wine, but I think this broader outlook has made them more receptive to doing things, to questioning things and doing things in a slightly different way. So there's a a new generation with a broader outlook, who are more open to new ideas. And also there's an increasing number of groups helping each other. Quite often they are groups that are based around ideas about regenerative viticulture or biodiversity, and they're helping each other establish biodiversity in their vineyards, or helping each other manage their vineyards, develop regenerative practices in their vineyards. But it also means that they've created groups where they feel more comfortable with sharing each other's wines and sharing wines from outside and sharing ideas and giving them somebody to call up when they've got, I've got a fermentation that isn't going right. I know you had this problem last year. How did you deal with it? Is there anything I shouldn't be doing? Is there anything I should be doing? And there's this exchange of ideas. And I hope that this fact that they are working more closely together in terms of improving viticulture and improving the way they make wines is also giving them the idea, and I think it is happening, that they need to work together to promote the region first and themselves second in the way that New World producers have been very, very effective in doing, and perhaps the French have been less open to in the past.
Well, it's interesting now that obviously things are changing. And with your book, though, everybody, you need to grab a copy. What I really liked, because sometimes as a wine drinker and a wine lover, you're still lost and you go, what do I want to do? What do I want to try? You've actually highlighted producers across a whole load of categories. From, you've got the rising stars, the age-worthy wines, there's the woman winemakers, and some blue chip names. So it was just, for you, was that quite important to at least highlight a few producers? And also, can you tell a few now, just to give us a little bit of advice?
So that was actually one of the most difficult things that I've ever had to do. It was actually an idea that came to me from outside. It was a fellow wine writer who said, most people get a bit lost. Can you give us some lists?
Yeah.
And actually culling it down to, these lists of 10 blue chip names, well, that was fairly straightforward. 10 women winemakers, well, yeah, that was tough, but that was okay. But oh God, the rising stars, that really gave me a hard time, because there are so many exciting producers that people haven't really heard of in Beaujolais that are worth seeking out. And I would be prepared to champion in a heartbeat. I guess I have with this book. So yes, lots of them.
Can you champion one or two here? Can you? Is that like picking your children? I mean, it's not your favourite. Let's establish that. It's who comes to your head first. They're just,
So some rising stars. One of the things that we've not talked about, you mentioned in this kind of pyramid, this hierarchy of Beaujolais, and you put Beaujolais Villages between the Crus and generic appellation Beaujolais. And actually, Beaujolais Villages is one of the most exciting regions, if you can call it that, in Beaujolais. It is a discrete subregion of its own. Basically, it runs down the west side of the Crus from north to south, and then veers east in a belt that separates the Crus off from the appellation zone. And there are 38 named villages, and much of the village zone is based on slopes. And I think what happened in the past was that the villages were possibly too high to ripen grapes reliably in an era when many of the producers used to have to chaptalize their wines. But in an era of global warming, when actually some of the producers who've got vineyards in some of the warmer sites in the Crus are struggling to keep alcohol levels under control, that altitude is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And the soil types are exactly the same kind of diversity that you find in the Crus. So there's some wonderful, wonderful producers in the village zones that are kind of flying under the radar.
Interesting.
At the moment. So, I think, who would I name? Domaine de Montjoly, are fantastic. Domaine Cilia and David Large, the Domaine Les Garçons, but all in the village zone. So I think they've got some really interesting wines.
I love that
too.
because it's just now everybody listening. I will put those three producers mentioned just in the show notes so you can investigate that direction rather than feeling like you have to go with one of the 10 crus or find your favorite cru. How interesting to start to get to know Beaujolais Village and explain to others that this is maybe where as well the value is. Do you think?
Oh, I think the value. Actually, here's another value tip. One of my favorite crus. I know I shouldn't have favorites, but I do, and we've talked a little bit about it. Is Chiroubles. Now, during the 2 years that I did my research, Chiroubles has lost more than 10% of its vineyards, and that is because it is so high in altitude and the vineyards are so steep. And I talked earlier about how difficult these slopes are to farm. And because there aren't any famous producers in Chiroubles, it's very difficult to sell your wines for a premium price. So a lot of Chiroubles is incredibly cheap and incredibly good value for what it is. And I think it should be 2, 3, 4 times the price, especially given the quality of the wine that can be made there. So I would say that as well as going out to look for the village, I would go and look for some wines from Chiroubles, and the producers that I would highlight in that context, maybe, let me see, Domaine de la Grosse Pierre, Domaine Pauline Passot. Actually, both of them are the same domain, and they're run by a woman called Pauline Passot, who is extraordinary. Domaine Chapelle make a wonderful, wonderful Chiroubles, and also Domaine Benjamin Passot. So there you go, 3 Chiroubles to go with your 3 villages.
I love that. Well, okay, now I might be getting a bit greedy, so I apologise. But you did say that Beaujolais can age exceptionally well. So say somebody's listening going, do you know what? I really want a Pinot Noir style, well-aged wine or a Syrah. Do you have a producer or two that you think...
So this is one of the big tragedies.
Oh.
You can find... If you want to buy aged Burgundy, if you look carefully enough, there are plenty of retailers who have stock of aged Burgundy or aged wines from the Rhone on their shelves because these are regions that are taken seriously. If you want aged Beaujolais, I'm afraid you're going to have to go and buy the current vintage and age it yourself.
And wait.
But yes, there are... So... In the context of aged Beaujolais, one of the producers that I would mention is the Château du Moulin-à-Vent. And I would mention them because actually the genesis of this book, one of the tastings that sparked the idea for this book was the Château du Moulin-à-Vent put on a tasting of some older vintages of their wines going back over the course of the past decade. And then they brought out some wines from the 1970s and the 1980s. And these wines were fantastic.
Amazing.
And it's like, why don't we take these wines more seriously? They're clearly, by any criteria, they are fine wines. They are elegant. They are precise. They age extraordinarily well. And yet it's very difficult to spend more than £30 on a bottle of Beaujolais.
Amazing. I mean, hopefully we've got people really excited to drink more Beaujolais. And also, I think I read in your book that some Beaujolais vineyards were more expensive than the now iconic parts of Burgundy. This is a region to really pay attention to. If people were travelling, and many people travel through Beaujolais on their way down to the south, and they're probably not even paying attention, what are they missing?
So first of all, they don't travel to Beaujolais. They drive straight past on the autoroute that goes from Northern Europe. So a whole bunch of Northern Europeans drive down to the south of France every year. And typically they either stop in Burgundy. So they often stop sort of around Dijon or Beaune. It's a handy stopping off point on the way down. Or they push on and they go to Lyon and they stop off for the night. And they don't stop in Beaujolais. And yet, Beaujolais is just off the motorway, folks. It's really easy to get to. It is just as convenient as stopping off place. It is phenomenally beautiful. It's very hilly. So every time you drive round a curve in the road, you see a different view. So there's that wonderful, wonderful natural beauty. The food is extraordinarily good. You've got everything from funky wine bars to Michelin-starred restaurants. And so if you stop off in Burgundy and you want to go and visit some producers, quite often, unless you can pull some serious strings, you've got to go and see a négociant, because it's only really the négociants who throw their doors open and do visits and tastings. It can be difficult in the Northern Rhone to get visits as well. But in Beaujolais, most producers, especially if you give them a bit of notice, are only too happy to throw open their doors and put on a tasting for you. I would give them some notice. And please, if you go and visit these people, buy a bottle or two of wine at the tasting, because these people are giving you their time and their expertise. But you'll often get to talk to and taste with the person who actually makes the wine. It's an extraordinary opportunity for anybody who's interested.
I've heard time and time again how open the winemakers of Beaujolais are. So everybody listening, make this a thing for 2026. And in the meantime, there is this beautiful book that everybody can read through. And I had so many other questions that I would so love to pick your brains of, but no time. But this book really deep dives from, there's the terroir maps, there's the question of whether to carbonically macerate or not.
What I'm hoping it also does is that instead of being a really dry textbook about, this producer it's based in this cru and makes their wines like that, I've told little stories about the winemakers, and I've tried to make it really readable and approachable. So don't, if you're listening to this and you're thinking, what on earth would I do with a dry textbook about Beaujolais? I hope it's not that.
No, and actually, you've got some beautiful images throughout as well. Loads of storytelling, and you can really start getting an idea of what you're going to see when you come and visit. So thank you so much, Natasha, just for sharing a little bit of time with me and my listeners, but also for taking 2 years to produce this book so that we can get to know this actually really exciting wine region better. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. We'll speak soon. Well, I don't know about you, but I am off to buy some Beaujolais Villages. You are going to find a link to Natasha's book, The Wines of Beaujolais, in my show notes. And do not forget to use my code EATSLEEP15 for 15% off this book, or on any of the others you find on the Académie de Vins website. Next week marks the first day of December. And in my book, that means we can finally scream and shout the C word. So next week is all about perfect food and wine pairings for Christmas. I will be chatting with Duncan Gamay, winner of the 2025 International Wine Challenge's Best Wine Club of the Year, with his wine box subscription service from Vinoteca. I'll be opening up his Staff Picks Christmas case, and we'll be talking about what's inside and why these wines are perfect for Christmas Day. Now, to finish, instead of a wine quote, here's that little wine anecdote I promised you, which I found in the handbook Beaujolais, Expressions of a Vineyard, which was published by Inter Beaujolais. And here it is. In 1932, Henri Monmanson, at the head of one of the largest Beaujolais trading houses, ran into one of his friends. "You sure seem upset, Henri. What's the matter?" "Oh, I just came back from Beaune, where an auction was being held. I had my sights set on a plot of Moulin-à-Vent that I wanted to buy very badly, but the prices shot up too high and the deal slipped through my fingers." "So what did you do?" "Since I couldn't buy that vineyard, I used the money I'd brought to buy Le Clos d'État, which was on sale at the same auction." 85 years later, 1 hectare of Moulin-à-Vent sells for around €100,000, whereas slightly less than 8 hectares of Le Clos d'État just sold for over 280 million euros. Up until right before World War II, a bottle of Moulin-à-Vent sold for the same price as a Voni Romani Premier Cru, yet today that difference is multiplied by 10. Wow. Wishing you all as positive and lucky a week as Omri had in 1932. But if not, I wish you at the very least a week of joyful sips. Until next Monday, wine friends, cheers to you.